What happens when one of Hollywood's most revered voices, a man whose gravitas commands instant respect, walks into what should be a simple morning interview, only to face the most disrespectful blind side in daytime television history. When Morgan Freeman settled into the guest chair on Good Morning America that October morning, the legendary actor whose voice had narrated everything from the cosmos to the divine, whose presence had elevated countless films into art, had no idea he was about to deliver a masterclass in dignity under fire. This wasn't going to be some minor disagreement about politics or a spirited debate about art. This was going to be 33 seconds of pure condescension that would escalate into the most justified walk-off in morning show history. The complete dismantling of a host who'd forgotten that his job was to elevate guests, not diminish them. And a moment that would remind millions of viewers that sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect is simply refusing to accept it. What you're about to witness is how a man who'd spent 5 decades earning legendary status reminded everyone what real class looks like when someone mistakes their platform for permission to be cruel. The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of the Good Morning America studio in Times Square. That iconic glass-walled space where tourists gathered outside to wave at cameras and catch glimpses of celebrities. Inside, the familiar choreography of live television unfolded with practiced precision. Lighting technicians made final adjustments to eliminate shadows. Camera operators positioned themselves for optimal angles. Audio engineers conducted last-minute checks to ensure every word would be captured clearly. The studio audience, a mix of excited tourists and devoted fans who'd arrived hours early for seats, settled into their places with buzzing anticipation. This was supposed to be one of those feel-good segments that morning shows excel at creating. A beloved actor promoting an important environmental documentary, sharing his passion for ocean conservation, inspiring viewers to care about the planet. Easy, uplifting, exactly the kind of content that sends people off to work feeling good about the world. Michael Strahan sat in his anchor chair, reviewing his notes with what appeared to be confidence, but was actually something darker. That particular energy of someone who'd decided he was going to make a moment happen, who'd confused his platform with permission to treat guests however he wanted. He'd been co-hosting the show for years now, had transitioned from NFL stardom to television personality with remarkable success, had become one of morning television's biggest draws. But somewhere along the way, success had curdled into something toxic. Somewhere between confidence and arrogance, between challenging interviews and hostile attacks, Michael Strahan had lost the plot. Morgan Freeman's car just pulled up, a production assistant announced, speaking into her headset. ETA 5 minutes to set. Strahan glanced at his co-hosts with a smirk. This should be interesting, he said in that tone that suggested he had plans his colleagues weren't privy to. One of his co-hosts, sensing something off in his energy, gave him a cautious look. Just remember, he's here about the ocean documentary. Keep it focused on that. Oh, don't worry, Strahan replied, his smile widening in a way that should have served as warning. I've got questions prepared. What Michael Strahan didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that Morgan Freeman wasn't some young actor desperate for exposure who'd smile through anything. This was a man who'd earned his legendary status through 5 decades of consistently excellent work, who'd been directed by the greatest filmmakers alive, who'd won every major award, and had nothing left to prove to anyone. And Morgan Freeman had survived this long in Hollywood by knowing exactly when to walk away from toxicity, regardless of who was watching. Morgan arrived at the studio entrance at 7:45 a.m., 30 minutes before his scheduled segment. At 86 years old, he moved with the deliberate grace of someone who'd learned to preserve his energy, to move with intention rather than haste. He wore a simple navy blue suit that looked both elegant and comfortable, his signature gold earring catching the light, his white hair and beard perfectly groomed. He carried himself with that rare quality that can't be taught or faked, the quiet authority of someone who'd earned every ounce of respect the world gave him. "Mr. Freeman, welcome," the production coordinator said, practically vibrating with excitement at escorting such a legend. "It's such an honor to have you here." "Thank you," Morgan replied, his voice carrying that unmistakable richness that had made him one of the most recognizable voices on Earth. "Happy to be here to talk about the oceans. It's an important subject." In the green room, makeup artists worked with reverent efficiency, their hands slightly trembling at the privilege of working on such an icon. Morgan chatted easily about the documentary, about the coral reefs he'd visited for filming, about the scientists whose work he'd gotten to witness firsthand. He was warm, engaged, genuinely passionate about the subject matter. Exactly the kind of guest any host should be thrilled to interview. "You're going to be great out there," the makeup artist said as she finished. "The audience is so excited to see you." Morgan smiled, that gentle smile that had graced 100 movie posters. "Let's hope we can get people excited about protecting our oceans." Little did he know that the conversation wouldn't be about oceans at all. It would be about something far more basic: respect and what happens when it's withheld. The show's opening segments proceeded normally. Weather news, banter between hosts that felt practiced and familiar. Then came the transition to Morgan's segment, and the energy in the studio shifted as crew members positioned cameras, as the audience leaned forward with anticipation, as one of the most respected actors in history prepared to walk onto that set. "Coming up next," Strahan said to camera, his smile wide but somehow not quite reaching his eyes. "We have the legendary Morgan Freeman here to talk about his new documentary. Stay with us." As they cut to commercial, Morgan stood backstage, breathing steadily, centering himself the way he'd learned to do before stepping onto any stage. This was routine. He'd done hundreds of these interviews over the decades. The questions were always similar. What inspired the project? What did he learn? What does he hope viewers take away? Easy, comfortable territory. But nothing about the next. 10 minutes would be easy. The commercial break ended. The cameras went live, the lights brightened, and Michael Strahan opened with words that would set off one of the most dramatic confrontations in morning television history. "Well, well, well," Strahan said, his tone dripping with false joviality that barely concealed something nastier underneath. "Look who decided to grace us with his presence this morning, Morgan Freeman." Everybody, the voice of God himself. The audience applauded enthusiastically, genuinely excited to see the legend in person. But something in Strahan's tone made a few people in the front rows exchange uncertain glances. That wasn't the warm welcome they'd expected. Morgan walked onto the set with his characteristic grace, waving to the audience with genuine warmth, his smile authentic and welcoming. He crossed to shake Strahan's hand, a handshake that was professional but noticeably brief before settling into the guest chair with composed dignity. "Good morning, Michael," Morgan said pleasantly, his voice carrying that unmistakable richness. "Thank you for having me." "Oh no, thank you for squeezing us into your very busy schedule," Strahan replied. And there it was. That edge, that condescension, that tone suggesting the gratitude was anything but genuine. "I'm sure it was really difficult to make time for a little morning show like ours." The studio went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of anticipation, but the uncomfortable quiet of people recognizing that something was wrong, that the usual script was already being violated. Morgan's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. A tiny shift that anyone who knew him would recognize as his warning sign. "I'm happy to be here to talk about the documentary," he said evenly. "It's an important project about ocean preservation, and I think your viewers would really connect with the message." Strahan waved his hand dismissively, as if the subject Morgan had flown across the country to discuss was merely a tedious formality to be dispensed with. Yeah. We'll get to all that, but first I've got to ask." He leaned forward with that smirk that was becoming more pronounced, more openly hostile. "Do you ever get tired of that voice? I mean, you've been doing the same smooth, slow-talking thing for what, like 100 years now?" The audience collectively inhaled. Several people in the front rows visibly reacted, mouths opening slightly in shock. This wasn't playful banter. This was an insult disguised as a question delivered with the confidence of someone who thought his platform made him untouchable. Morgan sat up straighter in his chair, his jaw tightening just a fraction. When he spoke, his voice remained controlled, but everyone could hear the steel beneath the surface. "I've been acting professionally for over 50 years, yes. And I'm proud of every role I've taken, every character I've brought to life." 50 years of basically playing the same character, though, right? Strahan pressed, his smirk widening as if he was enjoying himself, as if diminishing a legend was somehow entertainment. The wise old mentor, the calm voice of reason. "Don't you ever want to, switch it up? Play a villain, a comedian, anything with a little more range?" The air in the studio felt thick now, suffocating. Camera operators exchanged worried glances behind their equipment. A producer in the wings was frantically gesturing at Strahan to change course, to redirect, but the host ignored them completely, too committed to whatever game he thought he was playing. Morgan took a slow breath. You could see him making the choice to remain calm, to give Strahan the benefit of the doubt, to assume this was just poorly thought-out banter rather than calculated disrespect. I've played a wide variety of characters over my career, Michael. From Hoke Coburn to Ellis Boyd Redding to Lucius Fox. Each role has been unique and meaningful to me, representing different facets of human experience. Right, Strahan said dismissively, actually rolling his eyes on live television. The guy who drives Miss Daisy around. Very groundbreaking stuff there. Look, I'm just saying when people think Morgan Freeman, they think, oh, there's that guy with the soothing voice who shows up to explain things and be wise. It's got to be a little limiting, doesn't it? A little one note? Morgan's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, knuckles whitening slightly. His voice remained steady, but everyone could hear the warning beneath it, the sound of a patient man's patience running out. I think you're fundamentally underestimating the craft that goes into creating meaningful characters. Each person I've portrayed has their own story, their own depth, their own humanity. If that comes across as wise or calming, then I consider that a compliment to the work, not a limitation. Strahan laughed, a sharp barking sound devoid of genuine humor. Come on, Morgan. Between you and me, you've been coasting on that voice for decades. Put anyone with a deep voice in those roles, and they'd be just as successful. It's not exactly Shakespeare we're talking about here. The studio went dead silent. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. The audience sat frozen, unable to believe what they were hearing. Crew members stopped moving entirely, their shock evident even as they tried to remain professional. This had crossed from awkward into catastrophic. Morgan leaned forward, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet that somehow carries more power than shouting. Michael, I came here this morning to discuss a documentary that matters. A project about our oceans, about marine ecosystems collapsing, about the future of our planet. I didn't come here to have my life's work, 5 decades of dedication to my craft, diminished by someone who seems more interested in cheap shots than actual conversation. Whoa. Strahan held up his hands in mock surrender, his smile cruel and triumphant, as if Morgan's obvious displeasure was exactly the reaction he'd been fishing for. Sensitive much? I'm just having a little fun here. You Hollywood types are always so serious. Can't take a joke. There's a difference between humor and disrespect, Morgan said quietly. Each word measured and deliberate. And right now, you're not just crossing that line, you're obliterating it. Strahan's smile faded into something uglier. Something that revealed what had been lurking beneath his manufactured charm all along. Oh, I'm crossing a line. That's rich coming from someone who probably hasn't had anyone tell them no in 30 years. You're in my house now, buddy. This is my show. And if I want to ask you questions about your limited acting range, your one trick pony career, I'm going to ask them. The audience gasped audibly. This was beyond anything anyone had anticipated, beyond the bounds of acceptable behavior, even on television, known for provocative moments. Morgan stood up slowly, his posture straight and dignified despite, or perhaps because of, the chaos erupting around him. The movement was so deliberate, so controlled, so filled with quiet authority that it commanded instant attention. The entire studio froze, watching this legendary figure rise with the grace of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and why. Strahan's smile returned, triumphant and cruel. What? You're going to leave? Really? That's very professional of you, Morgan. Running away when someone asks you tough questions. Morgan looked down at the host with something that might have been pity, might have been contempt, might have been simple exhaustion at encountering yet another person who'd mistaken a platform for wisdom. Professional would have been you preparing actual questions about the work I came here to discuss, he said, his voice calm, but carrying across the entire studio with perfect clarity. Professional would have been treating your guest with basic respect, but clearly professionalism isn't something you value this morning. Oh, please, Strahan scoffed, standing as well, his face flushing red with anger and humiliation that he was losing control of his own show. You think you're too good for my questions? I've interviewed presidents, athletes, movie stars bigger than you. Nobody walks off my set. Then perhaps you should consider why I'm choosing to, Morgan replied, beginning to remove his microphone with practiced efficiency. Because I've been in this industry for over 5 decades. I've sat through hundreds of interviews, tough questions, personal questions, challenging questions. But I've never sat through one where the host was more interested in tearing me down than engaging with the work. Never one where basic respect was so obviously absent. Strahan moved around his desk, getting closer to Morgan, his body language aggressive and confrontational. The cameras captured every second, every micro-expression, every moment of this host forgetting everything he should have known about his job. You know what your problem is? You're an entitled diva. You come on my show expecting everyone to worship at your feet. And the second someone asks you a real question, a substantive question about your career, you run away like a child. Morgan paused, the microphone halfway removed. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but every word cut through the tension like a surgical blade. A real question would have been about the coral reefs dying in our oceans. A real question would have been about the marine life struggling to survive in waters warming because of human activity. A real question would have shown that you actually watched the documentary, or read any of the materials your producers sent you, or prepared in any meaningful way for this interview. He finished removing the microphone and handed it to a stunned production assistant who looked like she wanted to disappear. I don't need to watch your little nature film to ask you questions, Strahan snapped, his mask completely slipping now, revealing the ugly ego beneath. I'm the host. I decide what we talk about. And I'm the guest who has the right to leave when that host shows nothing but contempt, Morgan countered, his voice never rising, never losing control, demonstrating exactly what real strength looks like. I've sat through hundreds of interviews in my career. Interviews with journalists who challenged me, who asked difficult questions, who pushed me to think deeper about my work. But those were journalists who respected the craft, who understood their role was to illuminate, not to diminish. The audience sat in stunned silence, some with tears in their eyes, watching this masterclass in dignity play out before them. You're making a huge mistake walking out of here, Strahan said, his voice rising with desperation now, finally realizing perhaps that this wasn't going the way he'd imagined. You know that, right? This is Good Morning America. Millions of people watch this show. You're going to look like the bad guy. Morgan met his eyes without flinching, without hesitation, without a trace of doubt. I'd rather look like someone who stands up for themselves than someone who sits quietly while being disrespected on national television. Your viewers are smart enough to see what happened here, Michael. They'll know who crossed the line. What happened here, Strahan said, his voice reaching a crescendo of defensive anger, is that a past his prime actor couldn't handle a little bit of real talk. You want everyone to kiss your ring and tell you how amazing you are. Well, news flash, buddy. Your best days are behind you. That documentary you're so proud of? It's going to tank, because nobody cares about hearing Morgan Freeman narrate another thing in that same boring voice. The words hung in the air like poison. Even Strahan seemed to realize immediately that he'd gone too far, his face paling slightly as the magnitude of what he'd just said on live television registered. Morgan stood completely still for 3 long seconds. Then he smiled, not with warmth, but with the knowing expression of someone who just watched another person destroy themselves and could only feel sad about it. That, Morgan said quietly, is exactly why I'm leaving. Because you've just proven that this was never about having a conversation. This was about you trying to tear someone down to make yourself feel bigger. And I have too much respect for myself, for my work, and for the people who collaborated on this documentary to participate in that. He turned toward the exit with the grace of someone who'd walked hundreds of red carpets. Someone who knew how to make an exit with dignity intact. Wait, Strahan called out, desperation finally breaking through his bravado. Morgan, come on. Can't we just? Morgan stopped and turned back one final time. And the look he gave Strahan was almost pitying. Michael, I hope you figure out whatever it is that made you think treating people this way was acceptable, because you have a platform that reaches millions, and you just used it to demonstrate the worst parts of what power can do to people who don't know how to wield it responsibly. And with that, Morgan Freeman walked off the Good Morning America set, his head held high, his dignity unscathed, leaving behind a host who'd just learned the hardest lesson of his career and an audience that erupted in applause. Not polite applause, but thunderous, sustained, supportive applause for a man who just reminded them what self-respect looks like. The studio descended into chaos. Producers rushed onto the set. Strahan stood frozen, the color draining from his face as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. His co-hosts looked anywhere but at him, their discomfort palpable. The cameras kept rolling because no one had thought to cut them off, capturing every second of the aftermath. We're going to commercial, someone finally announced, and the studio lights dimmed slightly as the live feed cut away. But the damage was done. The confrontation was already spreading across social media at viral speed. Within minutes, clips were being shared on every platform simultaneously. Within an hour, It would be one of the most watched moments in morning television history, and the response would be overwhelming and unanimous. Morgan Freeman's car pulled away from the studio, carrying a man who'd handled an impossible situation with grace, dignity, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing your worth. Inside, Morgan sat in silence for a moment, then pulled out his phone to call the documentary's director. "The interview didn't happen," he said simply, "but I think people are going to hear about the documentary anyway." He was right. Within hours, the documentary's website crashed from traffic. People who'd never heard of the project were searching for it, wanting to support the work of a man who demonstrated such remarkable dignity under fire. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Strahan's attempt to diminish Freeman had actually elevated both him and his project beyond anything a typical morning show interview could have achieved. The backlash against Strahan was immediate and brutal. Social media exploded with condemnation. "I just watched Morgan Freeman handle the most disrespectful interview with such grace," one viral tweet read. Meanwhile, Michael Strahan revealed exactly who he is when he has power over someone. Disgusting. Celebrities weighed in from across the industry. Directors who'd worked with Freeman shared stories of his professionalism, his kindness, his dedication to craft. Actors talked about how he'd mentored them, supported them, treated everyone on set with respect, regardless of their position. Morgan Freeman spent weeks with marine biologists for that documentary, one environmental advocate posted. He dove with scientists, asked thoughtful questions, genuinely cared about the work, and Michael Strahan couldn't be bothered to watch a single frame before mocking his voice. That tells you everything. By that afternoon, ABC executives were in emergency meetings. Advertisers were making nervous phone calls. Strahan's co-hosts were distancing themselves in carefully worded statements. And throughout it all, Morgan Freeman remained silent, letting his actions speak for themselves. 3 days later, ABC issued a statement. "We sincerely apologize to Mr. Freeman for the unprofessional conduct during his recent appearance. We are committed to treating all guests with the respect they deserve." Reading between the lines, everyone knew Strahan had been disciplined, possibly suspended, and his position on the show was suddenly far less secure. But perhaps the most powerful response came from viewers themselves, ordinary people who'd watched the confrontation and recognized themselves in it. People who'd been disrespected by bosses, by colleagues, by anyone who'd mistaken power for permission to be cruel. "I just quit a job where my boss talked to me the way Strahan talked to Morgan Freeman," one woman shared. "Watching him walk away with such dignity gave me the courage to do the same." Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept disrespect. The documentary premiered 2 weeks later to record viewership. The opening featured a dedication. "For everyone working to protect our oceans, and for everyone who's ever had to walk away from toxicity with their head held high." Critics praised not just the film's environmental message, but its narrator's evident passion and authenticity. "Freeman's voice conveys genuine care for these ecosystems," one review noted. "This is clearly a project he believes in deeply, which makes Strahan's mockery all the more shameful." What started as a simple morning interview became a cultural moment about respect, dignity, and the courage it takes to enforce your own boundaries. It reminded millions that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you respond when that treatment falls below the standard you've set for yourself. Was Morgan Freeman right to walk off? Could this have been handled differently? Should he have stayed and tried to salvage the interview? The questions circulated through think pieces and social media debates. But to anyone who actually watched the confrontation unfold, who saw the calculated disrespect, the refusal to engage with substance, the host who'd forgotten his basic job description, the answer was obvious. Morgan Freeman had handled an impossible situation with impossible grace. He'd given Strahan multiple chances to course correct, had remained calm and articulate even as he was being attacked, had explained clearly why he was leaving, and had walked away with his dignity not just intact, but enhanced. And in doing so, he taught a master class that had nothing to do with acting and everything to do with life. That you teach people how to treat you, that boundaries matter, that self-respect is non-negotiable, and that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is simply refusing to participate in your own diminishment. The studio where it all happened continued its daily broadcasts. But the memory of that morning lingered. Crew members who'd witnessed it would tell the story for years. Audience members who'd been there would remember watching history unfold. And millions of viewers who'd seen the clips would carry forward a simple lesson. Real strength isn't about tolerating mistreatment. It's about having the wisdom to recognize it and the courage to walk away. Morgan Freeman, at 86 years old, with 5 decades of legendary work behind him, with nothing left to prove to anyone, had reminded everyone what dignity looks like when someone tests it. And that lesson resonated far beyond Hollywood, beyond morning television, beyond entertainment entirely, into the lives of everyone who'd ever needed permission to stand up for themselves. He'd given them that permission simply by demonstrating what it looked like to know your worth and refuse to accept anything less.